What's happening there? We got another UFC fight card to break down for this weekend. It is a rematch between Marcin Tybura and Sergey Spivac as the main event because, of course, everybody's been clamoring to see that rematch. So that's going to be our main event. It is a small card, only 10 fights overall. And then in addition to that, we had 3 fighters miss weight on the scale. So I'm recording this without knowing if any of those fights are going to get canceled. The one that is at most risk is the Yana Santos against Chelsea Chandler fight because that fight is supposed to be taking place at 135 pounds, but Chelsea Chandler weighed in at 141 pounds. So that fight certainly live to end up being canceled. But in the meantime, going to be breaking down all 10 fights on this card. I do think this is a really strong card to be leaving salary on the table. One thing I noticed running my lineups through our sims here is that almost all of my top projected lineups by simulated ROI do leave at least $1,000 in salary on the table. It's one of the easiest ways to build unique lineups on a card that's going to have a ton of duplicated lineups because of it only being 10 fights. So we're going to break it down right here. If you haven't done yet, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you want to sign up for the Stochastic Sims, sign up using one of the links we have below. I did end up winning the $3 150 max GPP last week, which was nice for a couple of reasons. First off, just always good to win on a slate, but also I had a really shitty card 2 slates ago, so it was nice to bounce back and win a GPP, and it's something that our Sims tool has really helped me with this year. This is the 5th time in the calendar year that I've won that $3 150 max GPP over on DraftKings. So if you guys do want to sign up and help build yourself better DraftKings MMA lineups, sign up, use the link that we have below in the description box. Also, it has FanDuel support as well, but focus a little bit more on DraftKings just because it is a much bigger UFC product where FanDuel doesn't have very big contests. But let's go ahead and start breaking down the card here, and we'll begin with the main event, which, like we said at the top, it is a rematch. I've got the Santos-Chandler fight pulled up here just because I was looking at that a second ago, and I was just kind of curious if there was any notes anywhere online about that fight potentially being canceled. But let's look at the main event here. Sergey Spivac taking on Marcin Tybura, and we saw these two fight a while ago. Not like forever ago or anything like that. It did take place in the UFC. It was 4 years ago. See here, Tybura against Sergey Spivac, and it was a fight that we saw Tybura end up winning. One thing that was kind of surprising to me looking back at this fight is that it actually was Tybura who was looking to initiate the takedowns last time they fought, and that was ultimately what ended up being his path to victory. He had 8.5 minutes of control time in a 15-minute fight. He shot 8 takedowns. He landed 2 of them, whereas Sergey Spivac was just either up against the cage or on his back for the majority of the fight. So typically, when we see Spivac win, he's the one that's initiating the grappling and the wrestling sequences. That was not the case in this fight. Now, I do think Spivac has gotten quite a bit better since we saw these two fight, whereas Tybura, I think, has kind of remained static. The one thing, though, that does definitely make me nervous about Sergey Spivac is his last fight against Cyril Gane was absolutely terrible, especially when you consider that there's just a very clear path to beating Cyril Gane. He cannot defend takedowns. He cannot grapple, but yet Sergey Spivac, who was at a massive striking disadvantage in that fight, only opted to shoot 1 takedown in the entirety of the fight, and it lasted, what, 1.5 rounds? He had finished at the 3:44 mark of the second round there. So that's a really big concern for me for Sergey Spivac because he's going to be at a striking disadvantage in just about all of his fights. But him not looking to wrestle against Cyril Gane when it was such an obvious path that he should be taking in that fight, it does make me nervous about what he's going to look like going forward. And then you also have on the scales today, he weighed in at 238 pounds, where when he was having a lot of success at the heavyweight division, he was weighing in much higher. He was weighing in close to the 265-pound heavyweight limit. So the fact that he's lighter, yeah, it does indicate maybe he's in better shape for the fight, but it's a little concerning. It's not the same form that he was in when he was fighting really well and was on a win streak not all that long ago leading up to the Cyril Gane fight. So the way I'm looking at this card and this main event is there are little spots that I want to take advantage of some of the discrepancies in ownership. So Sergey Spivac is the betting favorite to win the main event. As a result, we have him projected for a little bit over 50% ownership, whereas Marcin Tybura on the other side at $7,900, He's projected for 37% ownership. And I'm basically going 50-50 with these two fighters in my lineup. I do think that it's going to be a really close fight. So I'm splitting my portfolio, going about half my lineup, Sergey Spivac, about half on Marcin Tybura, which has me about even with the field on Spivac, but a good amount overweight to the field on Tybura, who also prefer a little bit for single entry, just because of the leverage that I think you'd be getting off of Sergey Spivac in what should be a close fight. And it'll be interesting. Do we see Spivac shoot takedowns again in this fight, or does he allow Marcin Tybura to be the one who's initiating, moving forward, and landing the takedowns? Co-main event, this is one that we're going to have to keep an eye on to see if it ends up getting canceled or not, because this is a fight taking place at 145 pounds, and Chepe Mariscal weighed in at 149.5 pounds on the scale, and I really liked Chepe Mariscal as a pay-up option, and it's not to say the weight miss makes me dislike him or anything like that. It just does make me a little bit concerned about what his cardio might look like in the later stages of the fight. Is he coming in with an injury that prevented him from training? Was he just not taking his training camp all that seriously? Because so far in the UFC, what we've seen out of Chepe Mariscal, all action fighter. And on the other side with Damon Jackson is not great at any one particular area, but he's okay. However, the one thing that is a definite downfall for Damon Jackson, really poor cardio, and considering the pace and pressure that Chepe Mariscal puts on his opponents, the way I was looking at this fight is that it could be competitive for the first, maybe 1.5 rounds. And then I thought Chepe could really take over in the third round and down the stretch. And you see a fight like against Billy Quarantillo, for example, where Damon Jackson won the first round of that fight. And then Billy Q just kept moving forward, put a pace on Damon Jackson, and just kind of broke him in the later stages of the fight. So even though it went to the judges' scorecards, Quarantillo was really dominant in the later stages of the second round and completely took over in the third round. And I think this fight could look very, very similarly. So hopefully the weight miss isn't a sign of other issues going on with Chepe, because he is one of my favorite spend-up options on the slate. Currently have him in 35% of my lineups. With that said, he is projected to be quite popular. We've got him pulling 44% projected ownership. One of the reasons that we do see a lot of ownership going to the pay-up options on the slate is when we talk about Chris Gutierrez and his fight, he is the biggest betting favorite on the card, but he's only priced at $7K on DraftKings. So he's kind of like a free square for a win and really unlocks you the ability to pay up for whatever fighters you want. So Chepe Mariscal, have him in a good chunk of lineups, but I'm a little bit underweight to the field, and there are other fighters on the high end that I'm going to be preferring. As far as Damon Jackson goes, I didn't really love him, but I do think that now that there's this weight miss angle from Chepe Mariscal, I think you could make a case that if Mariscal isn't able to fight hard for 3 rounds, then maybe some of those cardio concerns for Damon Jackson become less of an issue. So he's somebody who's worth looking at as a punt option, but I do prefer other cheap fighters on the card. Danny Barlow taking on Nikolai Veretinnikov. And I think he's a little bit of an underrated fighter, Veretinnikov, primarily because when we saw him fight on the Contender Series, he had a very difficult matchup. By the way, the UFC stats website's being very wonky as I'm recording this, so it's running a little slow at the moment. But he fought on the Contender Series against Michael Morales, and Morales is considered one of the top young prospects that we have in the UFC right now. And honestly, this was a pretty competitive fight. In the first round, there were 2 judges that scored it for Veretinnikov, and the Michael Morales was having trouble striking with Veretinnikov, had to end up going to the takedown. So you see in the first round, Veretinnikov lands 24 significant strikes, just 13 for Michael Morales. And then Morales goes, oh, I'm struggling to strike with this guy. I have to go to the takedowns. And then Morales was able to take over, wins the second and third round, lands 2 takedowns and outstrikes Veretinnikov in the second round, lands 2 takedowns in the third round, and also outstrikes Veretinnikov marginally. So it was a fight that I did think was rightfully a 29-28 decision win for Michael Morales, but not really a bad look and a loss for Veretinnikov, considering how well we've seen Michael Morales look since that fight occurred. And then as far as Danny Barlow goes, massive, massive power, but doesn't really look to wrestle. So with that being the case, I think this fight should take place on the feet. And that does make this fight a little bit more competitive than what I think the betting odds are currently looking at it to be. Because as far as Danny Barlow goes, you know, we saw him get a KO win on the Contender Series against Raheem Forrest, which I don't think is a very high-level opponent. And then he did have a KO win over Josh Quinlan in his UFC debut, which definitely a step up in competition. But it's not nearly as difficult of a matchup as what Veretnikov had against Michael Morales. So I think this fight could end up playing out competitively on the feet. I favor Danny Barlow to win, but as far as the ownership goes on this fight, Danny Barlow projected for nearly 50% ownership. I actually do like coming in a little bit underweight to the field on Danny Barlow and then taking some contrarian shots on Veretnikov because he is only projected for 10% ownership. And on a fight card that only has 10 fights, at least at the time that I'm recording, this could end up being even less later on in the day. The ability to get somebody at 10% ownership when I do think they're at least live to win the fight, that's a really good way to differentiate some lineups. I am picking Barlow to win, so I'm not going crazy with Veretnikov or anything like that, but I have him in 20% of my lineups at the moment, which has me double the field on him, whereas I'm a little bit underweight to the field on Danny Barlow. Next fight here, Chris Gutierrez against Kwang Lee. And I mean, the only thing we could really say here is that Chris Gutierrez, if you're playing cash games, absolutely play him. This is somebody who I think you absolutely have to be playing in cash games. 7K as a minus 650 favorite. The only reason that you would have any issues with playing Chris Gutierrez is number one, just ownership concerns, or number two, he's not the best DraftKings scorer, typically doesn't have a lot of finish equity, doesn't really look to shoot for takedowns very often. But with that said, he has just devastating leg kicks, and Kwang Lee is taking this fight on like 3 days notice. So Chris Gutierrez, there's a good reason that he's the biggest favorite on the card. I do think he's more likely to get a finish in this fight than most of the other fights we've seen from him. I am strongly considering just locking Chris Gutierrez into my lineups, giving him an ROI boost in our sims, and then just having the rest of the slate be made or broken for me on some of these other fights. Because Chris Gutierrez, even without making any adjustments, I have him in 3/4 of my lineups right now. So I do think Chris Gutierrez, all things considered, he's the biggest favorite on the card, and he's one of the cheapest fighters at 7K. Really difficult to look past that. So Chris Gutierrez, kind of a no-brainer option here. Play him in cash games, playing him in single entry for sure. And then Kwang Lee, I'm not looking to take any chances on him in large field tournaments, even though there is some leverage to be had there. I just think that it's by far the most likely scenario here that Chris Gutierrez wins and does it fairly easily. He's the best overall play on the slate. Yana Santos taking on Chelsea Chandler. And I just don't know what to make of the massive weight miss by Chelsea Chandler, other than it's like kind of expected. She's fighting at 135 pounds, which she has missed the 135-pound weight class in every single time that she's been booked to fight at 135 pounds in the UFC. And despite that, she's ranked in the division, which I do think to be kind of bizarre. Now, if you look at the overall dynamics of the matchup here, both of these fighters have very poor takedown defense. Santos defends takedowns at a 42% clip. Chelsea Chandler only defends takedowns at a 33% clip. But we very rarely see Yana Santos look to shoot takedowns. We haven't seen her do it in a meaningful amount of time. The last time she landed multiple takedowns in a fight, it was one of her first fights in the UFC. It was against Lena Landsberg. See when her page loads here. I think it was like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago at this point. So with that being the case, it is really difficult for me to project Yana Santos to land takedowns because that fight against Lena Landsberg was, 2018. It was on the undercard of the Khabib Conor fight, and she landed 5 takedowns in that fight. But that's the only time in her entire career that she's landed multiple takedowns. So with that being the case, Chelsea Chandler is the slight underdog in this fight. I don't have too much interest in this fight. I'm underweight to both sides of it at the moment. Chandler projected for 28% ownership. And then Yana Santos, just because of the size of the card and the lack of options, she's actually playing 32% ownership. So I'm underweight to both sides of the fight. But if I had to pick one side, I slightly lean towards Chelsea Chandler. She's going to be the bigger fighter after missing weight by 6 pounds. And then in addition to that, I do feel more confident that she's going to come out with a wrestle-heavy game plan. And if that is the case, whoever shoots a takedown first in this fight, I think ultimately ends up winning, because I think the first person to shoot takedowns lands those takedowns. And I have a little bit more faith that Chelsea Chandler is going to be the one who shoots takedowns. Now, with that said, the fight also might get canceled, and none of this ends up mattering. Toshiyama Kazama taking on Charlampos Grigoriou, and a super, super low-level fight here. The one thing that really stands out about Grigoriou, very, very poor cardio, and that's where there's a real path to victory here for Kazama, where Grigoriou, his last fight against Chad Anhelinger, he looked okay in the opening stages of that fight, and he was able to land some takedowns in the early going. And then by the time we got to the third round, just the wheels completely fell off him. So you look here at the stats and check this out. All right, so per round, You'll see Gregorio in the first rounds, and this was like very little action. Nothing happened really in the first round. 9 significant strikes to 8. Gregorio was able to land a takedown. He had a minute and a half of control time. Chad and Hellinger had a minute and a half of control time. Then the second round, Gregorio does nothing on the feet. He's clearly starting to tire. All he's doing is shooting takedowns. Does land 3 of them and is able to get nearly 4 minutes of control time, but he's outstruck by just strikes, not significant strikes. 68-4 in that round. Then you get to the third round. Gregorio is just totally death-gassed. It looked like Chad and Hellinger was going to finish him, and Hellinger lands 51 significant strikes, just 8 for Gregorio, who did nothing but survive in that final round. It was definitely a round you could have made a case for it to be a 10-8 round, although none of the judges scored it that way. So Gregorio, I do think, is the better fighter of the two. And then as far as Kazama goes, we have seen him so far. He hasn't looked terrible in his UFC fights. Well, I mean, he has, but the competition's been so high that it's kind of forgivable. So in terms of, he fought Rinya Nakamura. Well, most guys are going to lose to Rinya Nakamura. He's undefeated in the UFC. And then he also got KO'd by Garrett Armfield. And that was another fight where he just kind of looked overmatched. If we did see Kazama fight against guys like Chad and Hellinger, I think that he would have looked probably a little bit more similarly to something like what Gregorio did and had a somewhat more competitive fight against lesser competition. So the way I'm looking at this, I do think Gregorio is the better overall well-rounded fighter, but I just don't trust his ability to fight for 3 rounds. And Kazama's another fighter who's projected for very low ownership, and Gregorio is expected to be really popular. He is currently pulling, let's see, where is Gregorio here? Yeah, he's pulling 41% ownership, and I do have him in a good chunk of lineups. He's in about half of them for me. But then on the other side with Kazama, we only have him projected for 13% ownership. So kind of in the same way before that I was talking about taking a contrarian shot on somebody like the 10% ownership on Varetnikov, I feel the same way about Kazama. Where is he very likely to win? No, but there is a path to victory, especially in the later stages, and only 13% ownership. I think those are the ways that we just kind of have to differentiate our lineups on a 10-fight slate. So really just for ownership reasons, I'm taking some shots on Kazama. And then I also think it's kind of interesting to look at the third round props for him, because that is the way that I think he's most likely to win, is just Gregorio death gassing and Kazama ending up with a come from behind win in the later stages of the fight. Karel Hossa taking on Pannie Kianzad. And I think Karel Hossa is a pretty good target for DraftKings tournaments. She's one of these WMMA fighters who doesn't do a ton of significance in her fights, but she just has a lot of output. And it's the kind of output that often gets scored as significant strikes, like a lot of low kicks, a lot of teep kicks to the body. And then you get some of these Karel Hossa fights where it's like, oh, kind of a ho-hum decision win where she wins like kind of clearly. And then you go look at the stats and it's like, oh, she landed 125 significant strikes against Betr Bonus, or the fight against Vanessa Mello, where she landed 120 significant strikes and 2 takedowns. She has the ability to have some of these outings. And by the way, her last fight against Irene Aldana, you look at the stats here, 204 significant strikes landed in a decision loss. So just that kind of output where you see 204 significant strikes to 145, it's where even though a lot of Karel Hossa fights are very heavily favored to go to the judges' scorecards, they still could end up scoring well. And Pannie Kianzad, she had, I believe it was a torn ACL a couple of fights ago, and she's looked terrible ever since coming back. Ketlin Vieira dominated her, lands 3 takedowns. Pannie Kianzad looked very slow, wasn't able to defend them. And then the same thing happened against Macy Chasson as well, who ended up submitting her in the first round. So in a fight here against Karel Hossa, I think Hossa is going to be the one who's more likely to land the takedowns. I don't think she's going to have all that much resistance from Pannie Kianzad if she chooses to shoot them, considering how Kianzad's looked in her last couple of fights. And then if the fight does take place on the feet, I don't think Pannie Kianzad could keep up with the volume of Karel Hossa, who lands nearly 6.5 significant strikes per minute to 4.5 on the Pannie Kianzad side. So a fight with sneaky upside. I like Karel Hossa a pretty good amount for DraftKings tournaments. I've got her in about a third of my lineups right now. I don't have that much interest in Pannie Kianzad as an underdog, though. We've got here Jonathan Dinez taking on Carl Williams. Pretty straightforward fight. What we usually see out of a wrestler, grappler against a striker. Here's the thing, though, when it comes to Dinez, he can't defend takedowns really at all. We saw it in his last fight against Austin Lane, where Lane was a really big underdog. And the first round, you're watching the fight and you just go, oh my God, Austin Lane is going to run through Dinez in this fight, because Lane lands 1 takedown in the first round. And then we'll have the stats up here in a second whenever the stats site determines that it's done loading here. But what ends up happening is Lane just lands one takedown, and then Dinez just stuck on the bottom. He had no ability to get up. He was just trapped. Austin Lane was landing some heavy ground and pound. So you look here, first round of the fight, Austin Lane lands that one takedown, ends up landing 35 strikes overall, over 4 minutes of control time, really controls that first round. But what happens as a consequence? Austin Lane, who's not accustomed to fighting outside of the first round, no cardio left in the second round, just instantly gets knocked out by Dinez. As far as this fight goes, I just don't have cardio concerns with Carl Williams. I have IQ concerns where Carl Williams might choose to stand and trade on the feet as opposed to just shooting takedowns, because we've seen Carl Williams do that at times. For instance, he had a very clear path to just wrestle and win easily against Chase Sherman, but he didn't really look to wrestle all that hard, only lands one takedown in that fight. But then his last fight against Justin Tafa, he lands 7 takedowns, wins a decision pretty convincingly. This fight against Dinez could look the same if he chooses to wrestle. If he doesn't, we could see Dinez land a knockout. But I think the most likely scenario is Carl Williams wins, probably either by submission or by decision. But even a decision win for Carl Williams would come with a bunch of takedowns. It would come with a bunch of control time. I think it would score reasonably well. So Carl Williams is in 44% of my lineups as a pay-up option. I'll take some shots on Dinez just because he is live for the knockout, but not somebody who I'm really looking to get well overweight to the field or anything when he's projected for 25% ownership. Next fight here, Youssef Zalal against Jarno Aarons. And my initial thoughts on this fight, considering that Youssef Zalal is priced at $9,400 and that Zalal is typically not the best DraftKings score, was that I didn't think I would really want to be getting to Youssef Zalal and just get to other pay-up options instead. However, after looking over the fight a little bit more closely, Jarno Aarons doesn't defend takedowns at all. And by not defend takedowns at all, I mean that he has a 28% career takedown defense. Whenever we've seen guys shoot takedowns against them, they generally get them, and he has not fought against the best wrestlers either. William Gomes, for instance, who is a kickboxer without really any wrestling or grappling, took down Jarno Aarons 3 times in that matchup. So with that being the case, Youssef Zalal, who we did see look pretty impressive in the wrestling and grappling in his last fight against Billy Quarantillo, he does land north of 2 takedowns per 15 minutes. There's a real scenario here where we could see Youssef Zalal come in with like a Nurmagomedov type game plan, just look to wrestle and grapple. And I think could really put up a good DraftKings score. So a fight that after I looked into it and did a little bit more study on it, I ended up liking Zalal way more than I thought I would at initial glance, because Zalal not typically a fighter that I really like to be rostering for DraftKings. This fight I feel different about, even though he is $9,400. There are other pay-up options I like more than him, but I am going to be doing an ROI boost to get myself to a little bit more Youssef Zalal when I build my final lineups tomorrow. And then no real interest for me in Jarno Aarons as an underdog. He strikes at a really low clip, and I do think he spends a lot of this fight on his back. Let's see, what do we have next? Yeah, final fight to break down on the card, Stephanie Luciano against Talita Alencar. This is a fight that we saw take place on the Contender Series. It was a draw. Here's what happened in that fight. Alencar is very clearly winning the early stages of the fight. First round, she ends up landing 2 takedowns. She has 3 minutes of control time. She just overall is the busier fighter who does the better work. Second round, more of the same. She was numerically outstruck by Luciano, but once again, 2 takedowns landed by Alencar. She has 3.5 minutes of control time, but she starts to tire by the end of that second round. And then coming into the third round, Alencar has nothing left in the tank, nearly gets finished. She ends up getting 10-8 by Luciano, outstruck by significant strikes, 54-9. The total strikes 69-11. Luciano was also able to land a takedown in that round. And I don't know that this fight is going to look all that much different. Not that it's going to go the exact same in terms of a draw, but I think Alencar is going to be the better fighter in the first round and a half, and I think that Luciano is going to be the better fighter in the second round and in the second half of the fight. For the second half of the second round, third round, I have to favor Luciano to win those minutes. So with that being the case, I don't really love this fight for DraftKings purposes, mostly because I think there's other fights with higher finishing equity. I don't like that Alencar's cardio is so questionable. Looked a little bit better in her last fight, but there are other fights I think should score better. And then in addition to that, we do have Alencar, who is $7,700, pulling a little bit less ownership of the two. She's 25% owned. But if you do look at, let's see, where is she? What is the ownership on Luciano? Luciano. Yeah, Luciano projected for 37% ownership. That's another issue that I have with this fight is I think it's going to go to the judges' scorecards. I don't think it's going to score particularly well after how we saw the first fight go. And then also you got nearly 40% ownership going to Luciano. So there's other fighters that I prefer to end up targeting. Just for the lower ownership, I'll have a little bit more exposure to the Allen Carr side when everything is said and done. Right now, I have about comparable, which has me well overweight to Luciano. But it's going to be a fight that I'm overall underweight to the field to as I look to target other fights. So that's going to do it for us today here, guys. It is not the best fight card. It's not the best for DraftKings either, with it just being 10 fights and then the potential for other fights to fall out due to some of those weigh-in issues. But if you guys haven't done yet, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you want to sign up for any of the tools that we have here at Stokastic, sign up using the link that we have below in the description box. Thank you guys very much for watching, and good luck this weekend.